parent safety matters, a teenager's safety, siblings' safety matters. And actually, teenagers themselves report that a third of them have had some sort of a physical kind of altercation at least once with a parent. It does happen, and it can be quite unsettling and dangerous.
Hi everyone. Today's episode is about something really important. That is when you feel maybe afraid of your child or teen, or if you have worries that your child or teen may become violent with you. But before we jump into this really important listener question, we do want to acknowledge one thing. Right, Suzanne?
Yes, that today is different. It is actually podcast recording day number 2.
Yeah, this is a full retake because episode 1 was
a disaster.
Yeah.
So when we went to record episode 1, which we took this listener question very seriously, Annalise and I showed up to the taping that day stressed, overwhelmed, each of us exhausted for different reasons. And when we listened to it afterwards
and watched,
just like in parenting, we realized afterwards that when you feel that way, sometimes you don't give your best performance. And so as we would recommend to parents of teens, and as we try to do ourselves, there is always space for a do-over. And so here we are in front of you today doing our do-over.
So with that, welcome back to the Parenting Pair podcast. I'm Dr. Annalise Karen.
And I'm Dr. Suzanne Allen.
And I think we can jump right into this really important question. A listener wrote in, I live in fear of my son becoming angry and getting violent with me. I'm a single mother, and I know my son is kind and good at the core. But when he gets frustrated, he goes from 0 to 100 really quickly, yells loudly, and has pushed me more than once. He is now 6 foot 1 inch, and I'm actually sometimes don't feel safe or feel like I can't protect myself. He also sometimes leaves the house in this state, and I worry about him driving recklessly or showing others this side of himself. Please tell me what I should do. I can't physically restrain him, and I worry about it a lot, but I have not shared this with my friends since I don't want them to think poorly of him or me as a parent.
So I want to say a few things. First, I'm really glad that this parent wrote this because this parent is not alone.
No. Lots of people go through this.
Mm-hmm.
And I really just want to highlight there's so much that so many listeners may feel in this question. They can feel and hear the love this mom has for her son, the fear that she feels, but also her protectiveness of him. It's just so complicated, for people, but also that she feels isolated. She's worried about, sort of saying this out loud or other people seeing him in this state.
So there's a lot here, and we want to address all of it. And we want to start with, 1, this parent is alone in this. And 2, while we're going to dive into why this can happen and what we can do in these difficult moments, we do want to say that safety is paramount, and a parent's safety matters, a teenager's safety, siblings' safety matters. And so we want to make sure to address all of this because while it does happen, and actually teenagers themselves report that a third of them have had some sort of a physical kind of altercation at least once with a parent, it does happen, and it can be quite unsettling and dangerous. And we want to make sure that we address these
at times, right? So both things are true. This happens a lot in families, as you say. 1/3 of families may go through this by teen report, and at the same time, there are some times that it is too much, right?
Yep.
And so we'll
more
highlight
than an isolated incident.
Yeah. So let's start kind of with why this happens, right? And I think one reason that kids can become explosive or can become aggressive is brain development. The prefrontal cortex, or that part of the brain that really kind of pumps the brakes on big emotions, and big emotions happen a lot during the teenage years, right? It's not fully developed yet until the mid-20s. And it's notable that the majority, not all, but the majority of these sort of big explosive events tend to happen in the earlier part of the teenage years, right? So in that, sort of 12 to 15 age range, it's not terribly unusual for an explosive outburst or two to occur. And this is because the brains aren't fully developed and the emotions are felt so intensely, but sometimes teens can't fully genuinely sort of inhibit their behavior that goes along with those big emotions. So this is part of what explains it, but of course it doesn't excuse the behavior, right? And another thing that contributes to sort of more explosive or intense moments happening with our teens is really individual vulnerabilities, right, Suzanne?
Mm-hmm. Things like ADHD, anxiety, bipolar disorder, depressive episode. Some of these concerns can lower the threshold for explosive behavior. We know, for example, with ADHD, young people with ADHD experience more intense emotions, and also some of them struggle to inhibit behaviors. So often, when you have those kind of combinations of higher emotions, particularly during the teenage years, and then a greater difficulty kind of restraining or resisting
Stopping that
inhibiting.
behavior.
Yeah.
Yep. And another thing that can contribute to that, which can, correlate with mental health concerns, is when teens use substances, right? So if they're drinking alcohol or maybe using marijuana or other drugs, that can lower inhibition further, or in other words, make it more difficult for them to stop acting on maybe some aggressive or frustrated impulses, right?
So we have kind of that teenage and adolescent brain development. We have the individual vulnerabilities. And then young people are growing up in a variety of circumstances. And often our environment can make teens or kids more vulnerable to an explosive or difficult moment when they've experienced a trauma, if they're being bullied or really struggling at school in some way.
If they're going through some sort of stressor, maybe they've broken their leg and they've missed a lot of school, or they've been taken off their athletic team because of that, can cause a lot of, loss of independence and frustration that can lead to escalated emotions.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
So lots of reasons, why this happens. But probably what a lot of parents want to know is like, what is kind of normal or more expected, and when is it more concerning, when there's a kind of explosive event?
And I remember during one of our earlier podcasts, and I'm forgetting which one it was, you mentioned this idea of thinking about concerning behaviors and looking at it through this lens of frequency, intensity, or duration.
Yes.
And I thought that was a really helpful way to kind of frame that.
Right. And so if we think about that, if, we have a little less concern, obviously any explosive or violent behavior or aggressive behavior is of concern because it's indicating something important is going on that we probably need to tend to at some point. But if these episodes are more rare, they're kind of brief, right? So they come to a conclusion and don't last for an extended period of time. If maybe that day or the next day, the teenager shows maybe some regret or remorse over whatever happened, and certainly if no one was injured, in those circumstances, it's less frequent. They're on a lot of episodes. It's less intense, right? There's no injury or no very elongated event. We have less concern about it. It's when suddenly there's more of a pattern maybe that we get more concerned. So if it's more frequent, or if the events themselves when they occur are kind of escalating or increasing in intensity, so maybe becoming more threatening or more violent, or maybe if property's, damaged in some ways, those are cues that something, it may be a little more concerning and we might want to get a little more help.
And I want to just make a note quickly too about remorse and kind of apologies or accountability in teens. That sometimes that doesn't always look exactly how we want it to. Often we would hope or appreciate if our teenager the next day wrote us a lovely note or apologized face to face for their behavior. And certainly we want to work on encouraging that so that they learn in relationships. That's a really important thing to do, is to apologize to someone.
And we don't always get that, right? Yep.
But sometimes teens show their remorse or their apology by their behavior. They might do something helpful around the house or send a nice text about something else or say thank you for something that often they can show behaviorally because they're saving face. Maybe they feel ashamed for what they did the day before. Now, that doesn't mean that you still don't have a conversation about it later, but just to be mindful of that apologies don't always look exactly the way we think that they do.
But I think it even can be like that effortful change in tone. Yeah. Maybe from a place of anger to a more softer tone. If you notice that may be your teenager's best attempt to be able to signal, whoa, that got a little out of hand.
And I know that.
Yeah. And so we're highlighting here that kids and teens can be good, kind people and still have moments where their behavior is not okay and sometimes not safe, right? But we want to, I think, just take a quick moment to highlight, when are we really concerned? What are red flags where we're saying, we really need to do something more than just kind of get through an episode? And so just to highlight that, if you are really genuinely afraid, I would take that very seriously.
I think going along with that size and strength kind of imbalance, I think when we start to see kids get bigger physically, like that does just kind of escalate some red flags, a little bit of like, we might need more help.
Yeah, if there's a frequency to it, I think that's often the case. Also, if there's greater behavior such as like property being destroyed or, fist through walls a couple of times, or reckless behavior such as being in that intensely aggressive state and going and driving, right? If that might lead to reckless driving, if you're aware of that.
Or using substances.
Yes. So those are red flags to really, kind of be aware of, but really calling to mind, has this happened once or twice, maybe 3 times with some level of remorse within 24 hours and moving forward okay? Or is this something that's becoming more frequent, you're feeling afraid? That's when we want to be more concerned and maybe get more support.
Mm-hmm.
So let's go to in the moment of a time when a teenager maybe is acting aggressively, acting in an explosive manner towards a parent or just in, around family members.
Mm-hmm.
So right? What do we do?
I often think, to reframe this moment for parents, because, sometimes I think we feel like, okay, this is a crisis. This is a terrible moment. I've got to get control of this. I've got to stop this from happening. I've got to make sure my teen knows this isn't acceptable, right? And so there's this urge, understandably, to really control the moment. And I often say, if a moment has gotten to this level where it feels scary or deeply upsetting or potentially dangerous, your goal is to do nothing else except to try to de-escalate this and get the situation to settle down. There will be time for lessons. There will be time for discussions. There will be time for rules and order and all of the things later on. In that moment, it is try to de-escalate.
I think that's such an important point because you're right. The urge is often to make it stop, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're saying we can't really do that, but we can not make it worse and hopefully de-escalate. And how do we do that? One way I think is just by lowering your voice, right? No matter how afraid you may feel inside, as long as your safety is not an imminent risk, lowering your voice, taking a physical step back, even feeling fearful inside, attempting to act in a manner that's calm and not reactive and not meeting the emotion level that your son or daughter is presenting.
Sometimes that's using less words, calmer, softer, and less kind of directive and kind of demanding like a lot of things from them. It's just trying to step away and reduce some of that.
And the reason partly to do that is, of course, not to make the situation worse, but it's also because, remember, parents, no matter what, if someone's very upset and aggressive and emotional in a moment, they're not going to hear you anyway. Mm-hmm. So those attempts to help them problem solve or see it a different way or calm down, directly or control the situation, they're not going to hear a process because their emotions are in charge in that moment. They'll be able to do that, hopefully later when they're feeling calmer, right?
Yep. So first step is to try to de-escalate this.
Which includes not physically blocking or restraining them, right? I think sometimes parents can be worried, oh my gosh, I can't let them go in the next room because their siblings there. I can't let them leave the house because they'll get towards the car or whatever. But I think whenever you try to physically block and restrain someone, that can escalate things as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it goes in opposite to, right, the taking the step back and giving everyone physical space, that when you move in to physically block or bar them from something, that can feel like you're escalating it or to really threatening to them. Yes.
Right. And so really, we're coming back to doing less is more in these moments. I think another thing to keep in mind is it can be helpful if you're aware of this before it's happening or if there's a pattern to have sort of a trusted person on call, whether that's a grandparent or a neighbor, someone that your teen has a good relationship with, maybe that could show up if you need. Maybe having sort of a prearranged word or something that you could text them in a moment of stress that they would know, oh, maybe I should just go and stop by. Because sometimes the presence of another person, not to control or change the situation, but sometimes that sort of outside force can help to calm a situation.
And then to go along in line with, saying to not block or stop your teen. This is a really hard one as a parent, because if you are afraid that they're dysregulated and they're about to get in the car, or they are going to get in the car with friends who you're trying to stop them from being with because you're worried about them, it is our instinct to block them and protect them. But as we said, that can really escalate kind of the physical nature of a situation. And so knowing that, you can call for more help if you are really afraid that they're leaving the house in a level of distress and scared for them, to look into your state the number for the mobile crisis unit that assists families in mental health crisis moments. Calling 911 for the support and asking them for that are all things that you can do so that you don't feel like you're just letting them go, but you're not physically trying to stop them.
So yes, you can call 911. You also, if there's not an imminent concern, but you need help, you can call your pediatrician. As I said, a school counselor, a mental health professional, if there's someone always, already involved. These resources and these people exist to support you. So do not feel ashamed to reach out. As psychologists, we're very familiar and comfortable with receiving these calls. I think people can sometimes feel shame, but people who are, familiar with brain development and teenage development and what can happen for any number of reasons, we would rather support people. So do keep that in mind.
So I know we've been talking about kind of in the moment, but I think a lot of times we wind up speaking with parents about worries about a situation getting explosive.
Right.
Where parents kind of have identified, like, after a particularly stressful week, I notice my teen can become more emotional.
Or I'm letting my teenager know that we have to move to a new apartment, right? And I know that that's going to be upsetting to them.
I'm letting my teenager know that I've become aware they're using drugs, or have been frequenting a porn site, or have been online gambling, right? The number of things that sometimes parents may have to share, or a situation that's arising, and they're really scared to share this with their teen and fearful of what might happen, maybe based on previous interactions or seeing kind of escalating distress in the house. So let's talk a little bit about safety planning and coping ahead, which doesn't mean you can circumvent all this, but often can kind of help shift the environment.
Right. At the most basic level, this is also something that we have done as clinicians and psychologists. Just know where the exits are. Right. Sometimes, if you're worried about, a situation where you might need to step out of the apartment or home for a period of time, just be aware of the exits wherever you are.
And maybe positioning that conversation where you have access to a door easily and don't have to get past your teen in order to do that.
As Suzanne, I think, already mentioned, having a code word or something that you can text to a neighbor or friend or family member who might be able to come over and assist, should that be necessary, is a real easy thing to do, but I think is very comforting, even if you never have to use it.
And even if you have someone in your family or a dear friend who maybe really loves your teen has a good relationship with them, has kind of a calming, supportive influence, if they'd be willing to be present for one of these conversations in advance, would also be a really helpful thing, because it might help shift kind of the tone of the conversation in advance.
Right.
The other thing I would also say is, if there are siblings or other family members in the house, that one, speaking with them about this, that if there is some concern here, that you're aware of it, you're handling it. If it's a sibling, it's not something that they're responsible for, that you want to keep them safe, to help build some feeling of safety for them, because it can be quite alarming and frightening and distressing for a sibling when there are emotional outbursts or aggression or things taking place in the household. And you can do a little bit of safety planning with them also. If this is a sibling who has a cell phone, that you can have kind of a code word or something with them that you could text them if there's something going on. So if they'd either like to leave the home and go to a trusted neighbor or friend's house, or if they want to just be able to close and lock their door,
right,
I think can be really helpful too, and just kind of honoring another child's feelings.
If there's a pattern of concern, like this in the house. I think the final thing I would say about safety planning is, to the degree you can, having your phone accessible is important. Parents often ask us, but when would I make that call in an emergency to like the police or mobile crisis?
That does feel like a big step.
It feels like a big step. Parents worry what that could mean for their child, how that might hurt their child, and sort of balancing, protecting their child's reputation or that hurting their child in some way versus their own safety or their concern for their child if they were to become more aggressive is a really hard one. And so just to ground that, you should call for more help, and specifically 911 or mobile crisis if you feel imminent danger to yourself or anyone else, another sibling in the home, or your teenager, of course. If they're brandishing a weapon in a manner that feels unsafe or scary. If there's, sort of consistent and intensifying property destruction that feels, unsafe. Or if there's just a severe level of agitation that really is kind of scary. The reality is, oftentimes, if a police officer or 911 can be called, they may get there and really be helpful in helping you identify that this isn't one of those moments where this is what you should do, or they may need to intervene. But I think we don't want to rule out that possibility because your safety and your family's safety and your teenager's safety always comes first.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about before how to maybe cope ahead if you have concerns about this. We've talked about it in the moment. I think it would be useful to just give a little attention to after something has occurred in a household.
We want to have conversations about this if possible. I know some families, have a lot of difficulty communicating, but it is unhealthy and problematic to have a big aggressive event and never speak of it or act like it didn't happen, right?
And what one family's conversation looks like can be vastly different from another family's conversation. There might be families who can sit and speak about this for 5, 10, 15 minutes, and there may be others where it's going to be much shorter little drips, potentially over time, because for whatever reason, communication difficulties or emotions escalate again.
Right.
So all conversations don't have to look the same, but what we want to be modeling is ways to communicate about problems that are not solving them in physically aggressive or dysregulated, scary ways.
Yeah. And so I think coming, just if you're a parent, and this is, of course, any of these conversations come after the event, not during, when emotions have calmed down, speaking clearly, and with resolve that I can handle your feelings, I can handle your intense emotions, but there are certain behaviors that are not okay. And I love you, and I need us to work to figure this out together, right? Just saying there is a line that's inappropriate. And so when we're edging up to that line, you and I together have to cope ahead to make sure we don't get there again, or we have a plan if ever we do, right? Because I love you, and I don't want you to get hurt or me to get hurt, etc.
And what I like about that is it's putting you on the same side as your teen. You're on the same team together, whether or not they're agreeing, and aligning with this in the moment. You're acknowledging that you want the two of you to be on the same team at the same time that you are acknowledging that this behavior is dangerous, unhelpful, unacceptable in your family's culture.
Right. And I think it's important, to whatever degree a teenager is willing to have this conversation with you, to acknowledge that. That may feel uncomfortable to them, but it's hard. It's hard for kids to come and sit down. They feel shame or embarrassment oftentimes. They may still be feeling aggressive or having, intense emotions themselves. But if they're willing to sit with you, being aware of that and thanking them for that, also acknowledging, as Suzanne explained earlier, any remorse or acknowledgement of their quote-unquote teenage misbehavior or explosive moments when you see it, even if it's without words, right? If suddenly a teenager is being much kinder or happens to do a favor for you, that may be their apology, right? And we want to work, as Suzanne said, towards more direct communication of that. But that is something to acknowledge, because we want to build that relationship and signal to your teen that I am still in a relationship with you and I still love you, even irregardless of this behavior.
To go along with what you said before, that kind of beautiful statement of like, I love you and I do not love or condone this behavior, I think trying to put out with them in conversation that you want to work with your teen to de-escalate the situation if something starts to happen. And in those moments, the more simple the plan can be, you don't need a 17-step de-escalation, emotion regulation situation. Something as simple as, what can we do if this starts to happen again? You go there and I'll go here. I'm going to go take a 10-minute walk and then come back. Or you're going to go upstairs to your room and we'll, whatever it might be is a good idea, to just have kind of one simple thing that you each agree to do in that moment.
Right. And I would say include your teen in that to get their ideas of what it might be for them. 15 minutes on TikTok. I'm not sure what it is for them, but including them in that conversation, and also asking them secondarily, are there triggers or things that I do as a parent or that you may experience as a teenager that I may be unaware of that make them more upset, right? So identifying those things can be helpful. Sometimes parents do that by noticing, it's substances, right? That if you're vaping or, that something can increase the intensity of an interaction. But I just thinking ahead to getting your teenager to identify if there are things they know upset them, because we may not know what upsets them.
And it's funny you say that, because I think a lot about the things that I hear teenagers say. It's when my mom makes that face every time. I know what she's thinking. And we do know that teenagers, particularly as they get into stress, kind of can interpret our faces as potentially more negative or ill-intentioned than we might mean them to be. And so a lot of times teens will say, my mom says this one thing, or her face, or my dad starts walking around the room and does this, and then I know. Right. And so that's not saying that it's a parent's fault that a teen is escalating in any way. But if we can identify those things, and I think sometimes it can show a lot of willingness for a parent if they try to do something different in those moments, that can go a long way with the teenager and kind of shifting course a little bit.
And sometimes, and this is true both of parents and teenagers, so we could go in a million tracks with this discussion, but sometimes there are assumptions that we go into situations with that can lead to increased aggression about each other. I worked with someone years ago where the mother's key in the door brought to that teenager, she's going to be on me about the fact my lunch isn't undone and my bag's not unpacked and and that brought on intensity. And so then when the mom would try
to open the door.
Doors. She had no idea she was already coming into a place where the teenager was expecting judgment, anger, frustration. So then when she thought very easily, she was saying, hey,
how was your day?
How was your day? And hey, by the way, could you empty your lunch thing at 7:00 at night? The teenager would be like, see, I know it. But ultimately in therapy, we're able to identify that was a thing. I'm not saying that you could have a therapy session in your own home, but there may be things asking, is there anything I do that makes these situations worse that I'm not aware of? Because kids will give you feedback if you open the door, if you show that you are willing to receive their feedback and be on their team, as Suzanne says, towards improving these sorts of behaviors.
This, unless you have anything else to add, this is kind of bringing me to a little bit of the what now, I think, for us for today. And I think you were sharing that story, which was such an important one, that often we don't know kind of where someone else is or what they're bringing to the table, right? That this parent thought she was just walking in the door.
Right.
And this teen hearing the key in the lock.
Already was set up to a 6 out of 10 just by the key.
Yeah.
Right.
That sometimes situations and families in our lives can just be complicated. And so I guess what now that I might suggest is we can't always figure everything out on our own. And sometimes we can. And sometimes these incidents come up and they're isolated and they're blips kind of in a teen's life. And we move forward and we don't need outside help or support. Not everything, not everyone needs a therapist for every situation.
Of course.
But I would just encourage parents as you were listening to this today, if there are things that feel like some red flags to you or things that you feel really concerned about and you're not sure what to do, to reach out and seek help from someone. And whether that is just a close and trusted friend that you can share some of this with and get some of their feedback, or whether that's going a step further to, someone in your teen's doctor's office or a school counselor, or reaching out to a therapist to run some of this by, because you're not alone in this. And and there are people that can help. And if it is something a little bit more complicated, like the story you shared, that someone might be able to help you and your team kind of work through this.
Yeah. And that's worth it for sure. Thank you for this discussion. I appreciate it. I appreciate you guys
did this.
yeah, listening to round 2. Once again, if any of this resonated, if there's anyone you know that you think that this particular episode would be helpful for, please send it to them, share it with them. We want to get, our information out to as many people as possible. You also can help us by rating and reviewing the podcast on wherever you happen to listen, Apple, Spotify, wherever you might listen. It benefits us in helping getting that word out, because the more kind of ratings and reviews we have, the more likely it is to be sent out by the podcast
algorithms and gurus that somehow
the secret gurus that we are beyond our capacity. With that, we hope that you have a great week. Be well.
Thanks for listening.